Let's look at the evolutionary relationship among the four groups in Kingdom Plantae. We start with the most primitive, which means the less developed group Biophytes, to the most advanced land plant, which is the group Angiosperms. First, let's look at the generations here. When we say dominance generation, the generation that is dominant will have a bigger size. That's why when you look at Biophytes, the dominant generation is Gametophyte, which means the Gametophyte will be bigger size. Whereas if you look at the rest, the Pteridophytes, Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, all of them has the Sporophyte as the dominant generation. That means the Sporophyte generation will be the bigger size. Sporophyte, if it's bigger, then the Gametophyte will be smaller. Whereas for Biophytes, if the Gametophyte is dominant, which means it is bigger, then the Sporophyte will be smaller. You can see the relationship between the dominance and the size of the generation. The one that is dominant will be a bigger size. And how can this relate to dependence? We will have one generation depend on the dominant generation. Let's take Biophytes as an example. Gametophyte is the dominant generation. That's why we have Sporophyte depend on the dominant generation, Gametophyte. While if you look at Angiosperms, Sporophyte is the dominant generation. That's why we have Gametophyte depend on the dominant generation, Sporophyte. This is how you see them. Based on which one is dominant, then another generation will depend on the dominant generation. Satu generasi akan bergantung kepada generasi yang dominan. Kalau Sporophyte yang dominan, Gametophyte akan bergantung kepada Sporophyte untuk nutrition. But something is special here about Pteridophytes. Pteridophytes being in the middle of the evolution of plants, it has independent Sporophyte and Gametophyte, which means that the two generations do not depend on each other. Gametophyte boleh hidup sendiri, lepas tu Sporophyte pun boleh hidup sendiri, tak bergantung kepada satu sama lain. The next one, let's look at the presence of vascular tissue, which is the transport tissue in the plant. Biophytes being the most primitive land plants yang paling tak developed, so they do not have the vascular tissue. They do not need the vascular tissue, but they have similar structure to transport in the Biophytes. Pteridophytes being in the middle, it has simple vascular tissue, while for both Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, they are more advanced land plant. They will have complex vascular tissue. Both Biophytes and Pteridophytes, they do not produce seeds. We call them the seedless plants. That's why Biophytes and Pteridophytes, they are considered as the lower plants because they do not produce seeds. Whereas for the Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, they are the higher plant because they produce seeds. The difference between Gymno and Angio is that Gymnosperms has naked seeds that is exposed, whereas for Angiosperms, they have protected seeds. How is it protected? It's protected by fruits. When you look at fruit production, only the Angiosperm has fruit produced because Angiosperms, they are the flowering plant. As long as there is flower, then it can produce fruits. The other three groups, from the Biophytes, Pteridophytes to Gymnosperms, all of them do not produce fruits. Biophytes, because they are very less developed, they are very primitive, so they do not have the true roots, stems, and leaves. It looks like they have similar structure, but they are not true roots, stems, and leaves. Start from the Pteridophytes, gymno, and angiosperms. They have the true roots, stems, and leaves. Types of spores, as you learned just now, it can be homosporous plants or heterosporous plant. Bryophytes, because they are the most primitive plant, so they are very simple. They only have one type of spores. Whereas, if you look at angiosperms and gymnosperms, because they are more advanced land plant, dia dah develop lagi banyak, so they have two different size of spores, the megaspore and the microspore. That's why we say the plants, they are heterosporous. If you look at pteridophytes, it's being in the middle, so it will consist of both homosporous as well as heterosporous. Most of the pteridophyte plants, they are homosporous. They only consist of one type of spore. But some, they can be heterosporous. They will produce two types of spores. So you can see pteridophytes being in the middle. It has the mixture of both characteristics, primitive and the advanced land plants characteristics. And the last one, let's look at the water dependence in fertilization. Whether we need water for the sperms and the eggs to fuse. In the bryophytes and pteridophytes, the primitive land plants, they will need water for fertilization because they have sperms that are motile, which means they can move. These sperms are what we call the enterozoites. They can move, so they need water to swim towards the egg and to fuse with the egg during fertilization. And it happens in both bryophytes and pteridophytes. What about the two more advanced land plant group? They do not need water for fertilization. The sperms, they are non-motile in the group gymnosperms and angiosperms. So how can the sperm and the egg meet? It depends on pollination. Maybe through wind or other animals will bring the sperm and the egg together for fertilization to occur. Based on this table, you can see how the plant evolved from the most primitive bryophytes to the most advanced angiosperms.